It's my great pleasure now to introduce one of my successors, Dr. Karl from the Australian War Memorial, who's published a number of books, including books on special operations, and it's that subject which he'll now address with Commandos and SOE. Over to you, Karl. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and no pressure, Peter, for staying on time. Along with 40 other diggers from various units in Malaya, I was in a temporary camp. We've been selected for a secret mission, wrote Bill Noonan. All were single men with no dependents. There was a touch of adventure about volunteering for the unknown. So began the 22-year-old's private adventures with 204 mission, a British military mission to aid and train Chinese forces in their war against Japan. It was the 27th of July, 1941, and Noonan was one of a small group of soldiers from the 8th Australian Division who were about to board ship for Rangoon. Their ultimate destination was China. Later dubbed the Lost Legion, they were amongst the first to train in the techniques and methods of special operations, and were the first Australian soldiers to serve in Burma and China. Other Australians also served in this theatre with the secret British military intelligence organisation, the Special Operations Executive. Now this clandestine organisation initially recruited men and women with knowledge of the peoples, languages and cultures of the region. In time, SOE also seconded operatives from the Special Operations Australia and those with experience from the Australian military forces. SOE's activities in India, Burma and Southeast Asia were veiled under the cover of the India mission and later Force 136. Now the exact number of Australians engaged in special operations is unknown, but they were present across SOE's various elements and operations. The vignettes presented in this paper this morning offer just a taste as to the variety of Australian experiences. In 1941, the British were preparing to provide technical aid and training to Shanghai Czechs embattled Chinese nationalist forces. The Chinese agreed to raise 6 guerrilla battalions, known as surprising battalions, with the intention of sabotaging or destroying bridges and railways. British officers and soldiers will be attached to each unit. Preparations including establishing a British warfare school in central Burma and recruiting volunteers from British and Commonwealth forces in Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya and the Middle East. The school trained a force of about 250 strong, organised initially into 6 contingents. 48 Australians from the 8th Division joined the mission. They were dubbed Tulip Force. Months of strenuous training followed, with instruction in intelligence, demolition, sabotage and guerrilla tactics. The mission set out for China in late January 1942, making their perilous journey along the Burma Road, and this is the image on the top right. But Chinese reluctance, or really just a lack of interest, sapped the mission's momentum. Plans changed regularly, while language and cultural differences between the Australian advisors and the Chinese recruits were barriers. Isolation and boredom, combined with limited ration and illness, eroded morale. It was not until June that the force, now 3 contingents, 2 British and 1 Australian, moved to southeast China for an operational role. They travelled by railway, river sampans, and eventually on foot. After 7 weeks, they arrived exhausted in Chai Kai, Kangxi province. Cases of malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and typhoid were numerous, and there were deaths from typhus. Rations and medical supplies were scant, and there had been no mail from Australia for over 6 months. The promises of operations against the Japanese came to nothing, though one Australian party reportedly skirmished with the enemy while patrolling. Eventually, the mission was abandoned. An ambitious and naive undertaking, it really achieved little. The Australians were evacuated by air to India, flying over the Himalayas. 4 Australians died serving the Tulip Force and 204 mission. Others later became involved with SOA operations and Z Special Unit. Meanwhile, SOE had begun activities in the Far East in May 1941 with the creation of the Oriental Mission in Singapore and the India Mission. The Oriental Mission was to organise left-behind parties across Malaya to raid, harass and to conduct guerrilla operations should the Japanese invade. Agents were also sent to Singapore, from Singapore to Thailand, French Indochina, Hong Kong and China. Now, Australians were present within the organisation from the outset. An entomologist before the war, Captain George Winred had studied in Sydney and became a scientist for a sugar company in Fiji in the 1930s. Later moving to London, he enlisted in the British Army in 1940 and quickly moved into military intelligence. He joined the Oriental Mission in Singapore in May of 1941. 6 months later, he was sent to Bangkok, Thailand, to secretly investigate recruiting Asian agents for SOE. Now, Winred travelled incognito as a journalist, carrying discreetly forged correspondence from his supposed newspaper employer. A small number of people were recruited, but such efforts were too little and too late. The Japanese occupied Thailand on the 8th of December. Over 100 Europeans were evacuated, but 10 SOE agents were killed, and the rest, including Winred, were captured. The rapid Japanese advance across Southeast Asia quickly overwhelmed Allied forces. SOE personnel who were evacuated or escaped from Singapore were moved to India, with the India Mission absorbing the Oriental Mission. In November 1943, the India Mission came under the control of the Southeast Asian Command, led by the Supreme Allied Commander, Admiral Lord Lewis Mountbatten. On the 16th of March 1944, the India Mission was redesignated Force 136. During the war, SOE agents were dropped by aircraft or landed from submarines in Japanese-occupied territory in Burma, Thailand, Malaya and elsewhere. Patrols operated from isolated mountain bases or deep in the jungles. Now, these agents endured physically and mentally demanding environmental conditions, rain, monsoons, and isolation while recruiting and training local Asian fighters to resist and report against the Japanese. Those in the field were backed up by an extensive network of training, planning, and logistics support. Amongst those who served at SOE in Asia were over 720 Western women. Historian Richard Duckett has shown that just over half of these women were employed by the signals establishment, becoming known as cypherettes. And they were responsible for cipher groups in the field, sending and receiving messages from across Southeast Asia. Other women worked in clerical and secretarial roles. And these women came from Britain, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand and South Africa. And amongst them were at least 5 Australian women who had lived and worked in Asia before the war. Australian-born Joy Studholme Wilson, being Harris Walker, for example, has strong ties with Hong Kong, where her husband was an assistant superintendent of police. Now, she left the island just before the Japanese invaded, moving to Macau, which was then a Portuguese colony, and worked with the British consul to assist refugees from Hong Kong. Her husband, however, and other Europeans remained interned in Hong Kong. In Macau, Wilson was a contact agent for the British Army Aid Group. Working under the cover of an aid organisation, the group supported escaped British prisoners of war, gathered intelligence and ran operatives against the Japanese in Hong Kong and southern China. It was part of the British intelligence service MI9. In 1943, Wilson was with a party who escaped from Macau and went into China. At some point, she undertook cipher training. Fluent in Cantonese and French, the 28-year-old was recruited by SOE for the India Mission in August 1943. And 3 months later, she became the head of the cipher section in Calcutta. Now, other members of the Australian forces were also seconded and posted to the special operations in Southeast Asia Command. Colin Bell, for instance, top left, had been a company executive before the war, joining the Royal Australian Air Force in September of 1940. He focused on intelligence duties and had a brief period with the RAAF in Ambon before it fell to the Japanese. Specialising in psychological warfare, he was quickly promoted. By 1943, he was Deputy Director of the Far East Liaison Office, or FILO, essentially a military propaganda section with the rank of wing commander. He travelled widely in this role, liaising and visiting Allied counterparts in Britain and the India mission. Now, Bell must have made very favourable impressions on his hosts in New Delhi. Following his visit, he was essentially headhunted by Lord Mountbatten to become the Director of Psychological Warfare. Writing to Generals Douglas MacArthur and Sir Thomas Blaney in November 1943, Mountbatten said that Bell's knowledge of British and American psychological warfare organisations in different theatres would not only be of great advantage to us, but would also bring together the psychological warfare activities of both commands. Mountbatten realised the difficulty in finding officers experienced in these duties, but these aspects of warfare is so important and its integration between adjacent commands so necessary that a really good man here would be a godsend. Promoted to group captain, Bell took on the role in early 1944. His new psychological warfare branch became part of Force 136. Now, like FILO, it consisted of an India field broadcasting unit, mobile printing sections, and a training camp. Force 136's first infiltration operations into Malaya was conducted in May 1943, when a group was landed by submarine in Perak, on the northwest coast. Now, this operation proved that deep insertions were possible, but it was only when the long-range, four-engine consolidated V-24 Liberators became available to Force 136 that maintaining insertion parties became practical. Thereafter, beginning with Operation Qatar in September 1944, Force 136 conducted another 12 major infiltration operations, with parties operating along the west and east coast of the Malay Peninsula. Their roles were principally to gather intelligence and to train and equip Malay guerrilla groups, mostly from the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. Two of these missions, Operations Carter and Pontoon, had an Australian presence, with personnel from SOA and Z Special Unit. Operation Pontoon, I'm seeing down the bottom, left and the right. Operation Pontoon operated in the mountainous regions of Pahang in central Malaya. Led by Major George Leonard, image cigarette hanging out his mouth. It's led by Leonard. The group included Captains Noel Robinson, Jack Chapman and John Morrison, along with radio operators and Chinese interpreters. Leonard, Robson and Chapman and two others parachuted into Pahang on the 24th of February 1945. Morrison followed a month later on the next full moon. Now, their objective was to contact the local regiment of the MPAJA to equip and train it as a force to fight against the Japanese in central Malaya in anticipation of a future British landing along the Malayan coastline. Major Leonard had been born in India to British parents and had actually worked as a game warden in Malaya before the war. He served with the Federated Malay States Volunteer Force and later became an intelligence officer in an Indian division. He was fluent in Malay and Hindustani. He came to Australia on leave in 1941 and then joined the Australian Army, where he met Robson, Chapman and Morrison. The three Australians were among the original officers on the formation of the 2nd 8th Independent Company in July 1942. They were joined a few months later by Leonard. They were transferred together to Z Special Unit in early 1944, where they were then seconded to Force 136 in August and sailed for Colombo for an additional 6 months of specialist training across India before they parachute dropped into Pahang. Now, Leonard had selected the drop zone in Malaya as he was familiar with the area. Once on the ground, however, he discovered that the MPAJA regimental headquarters was over 400 kilometres away. The Pontoon men broke into patrols and trekked across Pahang to reach the guerrillas' headquarters, sometimes travelling by raft or canoe. They regularly moved camps, recruited local Malays, and made contact with different groups of Chinese guerrillas. At times, the guerrillas were uncooperative or just hostile. At one point, Robson and his party were held virtually as prisoners by the guerrillas, and the conditions were Spartan. As I had been in the Boy Scouts, noted Morrison in his diary, I was appointed doctor, surgeon and dentist. So I checked the medical stores. It contained a good pair of surgical scissors, and I also became the barber for beard trimming. Now, despite the difficulties, by the war's end, Leonard had established a comprehensive intelligence network and had control of over 350 guerrillas. They were armed and dangerous, but their military effectiveness was questionable, as Morrison noted in his diary in August 1945. I took 50 men for firing. The safest place was in front of them. Generally no idea of safety, and coupled with extreme nervousness, they are a menace. Again, bottom right image. I finished the firing exercise by choosing men for future warlike roles by appearance only. To conclude, Southeast Asia was not a theatre where Australian Special Operation Forces deployed during the war as discrete units or distinctive formations. There is no single story. Instead, there was a diverse variety of unique personal narratives, highlighting the depth and diversity of Australia's wartime experience. Individual Australians also served in the British forces either directly or either being seconded or loaned from Australian units. They were agents, secretaries, cyphrettes and staff officers. They led guerrilla units deep behind the lines in Japanese-controlled China and Malaya, and are also airmen who supported Allied special operations in India, Burma, Malaya and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl. And there will be opportunity for questions at the conclusion of our third speaker.